They hung her with a sign that said Indian lover, until a bear cub pulled at her dress. The dusty western town had gathered in the square, their faces twisted with hate as they dragged the woman to the hanging tree. The crude wooden sign bounced against her chest with each stumbling step she took. The mob shouted curses at her, calling her a traitor to her own kind. But as the rope pulled tight around her neck and her feet left the ground, something impossible happened. A small bear cub wandered out from the woods, walked straight through the angry crowd, and began tugging at the hem of her dress. What happened next would bring a terrible justice to the town that had condemned an innocent woman. Lillian had lived alone on her small farm outside Redemption Gulch for 3 years now. Her husband had died of fever the winter after they arrived, leaving her to work the rocky soil by herself. She kept to herself mostly, only coming to town once a month for supplies. The other women whispered about her when she passed, wondering why she didn't remarry or move back east where a little belonged. But Lillian had grown to love the wild country around her farm. She liked the way the mountains looked purple at sunset, and how the creek sang different songs depending on the season. Redemption Gulch was a hard place full of hard people. The town had sprouted up around a small gold claim that never amounted to much, and disappointment had soured into meanness. At the center of it all stood Reverend Blackwood, a tall man with eyes like chips of coal. Every Sunday he thundered from his pulpit about the dangers that surrounded them. He preached that the native tribes were agents of the devil, sent to test the faith of good Christian folk. He said that anyone who showed them kindness was inviting evil into their hearts. The townspeople nodded along, their fear growing with each sermon. One scorching July day, Lillian's well ran dry. She had been rationing water for a week, giving most of it to her 2 cows in the vegetable garden that kept her alive. By the time she realized the well was completely empty, she was already weak from thirst. She tried to dig deeper, but the ground was hard as iron, and she didn't have the strength. She sat in the shade of her porch, wondering if this was how she would die, when she saw a figure approaching from the hills. The man was tall and moved with the easy grace of someone who knew the land like the back of his hand. As he got closer, Lillian saw his dark skin and long black hair. He was from one of the native tribes that lived in the mountains. Fear and thirst fought inside her chest. The man stopped at the edge of her property, studying her dried garden and the bucket sitting useless by the well. Without a word, he turned and walked back the way he came. Lillian thought he had left her to die, but an hour later, he returned carrying 2 large water skins. He set them on her porch and pointed to the east, making a flowing motion with his hands. There was a spring there, he was telling her, hidden but reliable. Before she could thank him, he was gone, disappearing into the landscape like smoke. Lillian drank deeply, the cool water bringing her back to life. The next morning, she followed his directions and found the spring exactly where he had indicated. It bubbled up clear and cold from between 2 rocks, hidden by a cluster of cottonwood trees. Over the next week, she saw him twice more. Once, he left a bundle of herbs on her porch when her cough had kept her up for 3 nights straight. Another time, she found a freshly killed rabbit hanging from her fence post when she had mentioned to the wind that she was tired of eating beans. She learned his name was Kael when she finally worked up the courage to speak to him. He knew more English than he first let on, and she knew a few words of his language that she had picked up from a traveling trader. They would sit on her porch sometimes, not saying much, just watching the sunset behind the mountains. It was Mrs. Henderson who saw Kael leaving Lillian's property one evening. The older woman had been riding past on her way back from visiting her sister when she spotted him walking down the path from Lillian's cabin. By the time Mrs. Henderson reached town, the story had grown. She told everyone at the general store that she had seen that native man coming out of the widow's house, and who knew what ungodly things were happening out there. The news spread through Redemption Gulch like wildfire in dry grass.
We must not have this.
That Sunday, Reverend Blackwood's sermon was darker than usual. He spoke of a serpent that had slithered into their midst, a woman who had forgotten her place and her people. He didn't say Lillian's name, but everyone knew who he meant. He pounded his fist on the pulpit and declared that God would punish them all if they allowed such sin to continue. The congregation shifted in their seats, stealing glances at each other, their fear and anger building with each word. The very next week, a blight struck the town's crops. The corn withered in the fields, turning black at the roots. The wheat fell over as if pushed by invisible hands. Even the hardy vegetables in kitchen gardens shriveled up and died. Reverend Blackwood stood in the middle of the ruined fields and pointed toward Lillian's farm in the distance. This was God's punishment, he said, for tolerating evil in their midst. The unholy alliance between the widow and the savage had brought a curse upon them all. The mob formed quickly after that. 20 men and women, their faces red with righteous anger, marched to Lillian's farm as the sun began to set. They found her tending to her own garden, which had mysteriously survived the blight. This only confirmed their suspicions. They surrounded her, shouting accusations and demanding that she confess her sins. They wanted her to renounce Kael, to beg for their forgiveness in God's mercy. But Lillian stood tall, her chin raised despite her shaking hands. She looked them each in the eye and spoke in a clear voice. She told them that Kael had shown her more kindness in a few weeks than any of them had shown in 3 years. He had saved her life with water when none of them had even checked to see if she was alive during the drought. He had brought her medicine when she was sick, while they had walked past her farm without a second glance. If helping a neighbor was a sin, she said, then she would rather be damned than be like them. Her words hit them like a slap, but instead of shame, they felt only rage. How dare she lecture them? How dare she choose a savage over her own kind? Reverend Blackwood pushed through the crowd, his face purple with fury. He declared her a traitor and an agent of evil. She had brought the devil's curse upon their town, and there was only one way to cleanse themselves. The mob surged forward, grabbing Lillian's arms and dragging her toward town. The hanging tree was an old oak that stood in the center of Redemption Gulch's main square. It had been used 3 times before, always for horse thieves or murderers. Never for a woman whose only crime was accepting help from someone with different colored skin. They forced Lillian to stand on a wooden box beneath the tree's thickest branch. Someone had made a sign from a piece of barnwood, the words Indian lover painted in black tar. They hung it around her neck like a badge of shame. Reverend Blackwood stood before the crowd and raised his hands to the darkening sky. He prayed loudly, asking God to witness their righteousness and accept this sacrifice to cleanse the town. He called Lillian a vessel of corruption, who had chosen darkness over light. The crowd murmured their amens, but some looked away, unable to meet Lillian's steady gaze. She didn't cry or beg. She stood straight, the sign heavy against her chest. When Blackwood finished his prayer, he nodded to the men holding the rope. They pulled, and the box was kicked away. Lillian's feet left the ground, and the rope bit into her neck. The crowd watched in terrible silence as she struggled, her hands clawing at the noose. Some of the women turned away, but the men forced themselves to watch, telling themselves this was justice. But then something impossible happened. From the edge of the woods, a small shape emerged. It was a bear cub, no bigger than a large dog, its fur brown and fuzzy. It walked through the crowd as if they weren't there, patting on soft paws straight toward the hanging tree. People stepped back in shock, creating a path for the creature. The cub reached Lillian, who was still struggling weakly, her face turning purple. It stood on its hind legs and began tugging at the hem of her dress with its small teeth and claws. The crowd gasped. Some fell to their knees. Others backed away in terror. In their superstitious minds, this was no ordinary bear. This was a sign, an omen, a curse made real. They had heard stories from travelers about the spirit animals that protected the native tribes, about the revenge that nature could take on those who broke its laws. The bear cub continued to pull at Lillian's dress, making small growling sounds that seemed to echo in the silent square. Someone screamed. Another person shouted that they were all cursed. The carefully built mob mentality shattered like glass. In the chaos, a young man named Thomas, who had always been sweet on Lillian before her husband died, ran forward with his knife and cut the rope. Lillian fell to the ground, gasping and coughing, her hands clutching her throat. The sign around her neck had broken in half when she fell. The crowd was scattering now, running for their homes, terrified of what they had almost done, and what punishment might come for them. Reverend Blackwood stood frozen, his mouth open but no words coming out. His absolute authority had been broken by a single small bear. Then, from the shadows at the edge of the square, Kael appeared. He walked slowly, deliberately, his dark eyes taking in the scene. The few people who remained fell back further, too afraid to run and too afraid to stay. Kael knelt beside Lillian and gently helped her sit up. She was breathing roughly, but she was alive. He looked at the broken sign, then up at Reverend Blackwood, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. Without a word, Kael lifted Lillian in his arms and began walking toward the woods. The bear cub followed them, padding along beside them like a small guardian. They disappeared into the darkness between the trees, leaving the town in shameful silence. Redemption Gulch never recovered from that night. The blight on their crops worsened, spreading to their livestock, and even the wild game fled the area. Reverend Blackwood left town within a week, his congregation no longer listening to his words. The people who remained lived with the weight of what they had almost done, jumping at shadows and wondering when their punishment would come. Some said they could hear drums in the mountains at night. Others claimed to see bear tracks around their homes in the morning. The hanging tree died that winter, its leaves turning black and falling all at once on a windless day. By spring, most of the town had moved on, seeking new places where their shame couldn't follow. The buildings stood empty, slowly being reclaimed by the desert. Nature was taking back what had always belonged to it. As for Lillian, no one from the town ever saw her again. Some said Kael's tribe took her in, that she lived with them in the mountains, where she had found the family that the town had denied her. Others said she had become something more than human, a guardian spirit of the wild places, protecting those who showed kindness regardless of skin color or origin. The truth didn't matter as much as the lesson. The town that had hung a woman for accepting help from a native man had been destroyed by their own hatred and fear. They had called her an Indian lover, as if it were the worst thing a person could be. But in the end, it was Lillian who survived, saved by the very connections they had tried to kill her for. The bear cub that had tugged at her dress had shown more humanity than any of them. And in the wilderness they feared, she had found the peace that their civilization could never give her. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of the Old West, where justice comes in unexpected forms. Drop a comment below about what you think really happened to Lillian after that night. Did she find a new life with Kael's people, or did she become something more? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story of prejudice, courage, and the wild justice of nature itself.